It's Black Friday, and I got some great deals on some Legendary Dragon card reviews. That's right, they're free.
Hey, buddy, watch this.
Oh, yeah, bringing you some more of that free content. It's your boy Regis. Starting with this new legendary card, it's Nathaok, a new 6 mana 5/5 legendary dragon for Shaman. His battlecry reads summon 2/0/3 eggs. Next turn, they hatch into 4/4 drakes with Rush. So in total, that's a lot of stats, right? For 6 mana, not only do you get the initial 5/5, but you get another 8/8 total on the delay here from Nathaok. So that gives us a total of 13/13 in stats, which is clearly more than you'd expect for 6 mana, really almost twice as much as you'd expect for 6 mana. And at first glance, I think that makes this card seem like a pretty good deal. Like, all those stats, man, that's incredible. But of course, there is a delay, and that can be rather problematic. It's not necessarily an issue because you're expecting your opponent to like silence off your eggs. I think those eggs are most often going to activate, as we see Hearthstone today. But you are giving your opponent the ability to play, say like 5 health minions that trade really well into 4/4s, for instance, because you're giving them knowledge and you're giving them initiative to play around your game plan. Now, on the other side of things, this is a battle cry, and as we know, Quest Shaman can do some pretty silly stuff with battle cries right now. So theoretically, you could hit the button for 8 mana total and summon 2 more eggs for a total of, 16 in stats on board. And that could start to become problematic for your opponent. But once again, with Nathaok, it's kind of a one-time thing. Your opponent knows what to do. They save that Flame Strike, they save their removal, their brawl, whatever it is, and your Nathaok kind of falls flat in that scenario. To me, that means that this card looks a little more awkward than like just crazy high powered. At the end of the day, it is just stats on board. You're kind of sitting there helplessly letting your opponent do stuff. God forbid they have like a mass dispel, for instance, and then your eggs are just chilling. Maybe there's still some synergies there with something like Bloodlust. Clearly there are possibilities with a card like this just because it does dump a lot of things onto the board, and Shaman historically has been good at dumping things onto the board and leveraging those things, but I don't think this goes quite wide enough. I think the mana cost is a little bit too high to utilize super successfully with the hero power. Typically, Quest Shaman likes cheaper things where they can play 4 or 5 battle cries in a single turn, more of that lackey style of play. So as you start creeping up to that 6 mana slot, it's a lot harder to squeeze these battle cries out. But, there is still Shutterwalk in standard format for now. There's still things like Barista Lynchin to get copies of this. So I'm not ruling it out by any means. It just doesn't feel like it's going to be as good as what Battlecry Shaman does now. It doesn't feel like it's good enough to empower a dragon-style deck. So when I look at the context, when I look at the synergies, Nathaok just seems to fall a little bit short to me. It's not doing anything special enough, fast enough. It's not doing anything decisive enough, and that probably means it's a card that's going to get left behind in a lot of cases. And next up here, folks, we have Bandersmosh, a card that I've seen some pretty harsh reactions to. A lot of people are saying this is a new Shifter Xeris, but hear me out. I got a different take. Bandersmosh is a 5 mana 5/5. Each turn this is in your hand, transform it into a 5/5 copy of a random legendary minion. Now, I'm assuming this is going to retain its 5 mana cost because it wouldn't really make sense if it didn't. And what that means is you've got a card here that's going to have some crazy high roll potential. Imagine things like Imris or a Dragon Queen Alexstrasza coming down for 5 mana. And you start to see how crazy this card could be, particularly any kind of Battlecry synergies with a Quest Shaman. There are some absurd high rolls here. And the cool thing about Bandersmosh is I don't think it's just high rolls. It fixes problems for legendary cards in 2 ways. Whereas something like Archvillain or Faum adds random legendaries to your hand, they're hard to work with. Some just have bad stats, some are too high cost and too slow. Bandersmosh fixes both of those problems. If their stats are bad, Bandersmosh pulls their stats up to a reasonable 5 cost level. If they're too expensive, Bandersmosh pulls their mana down to a reasonable 5 mana level. So he kind of pulls in those outliers that suck and makes everything feel okay, but still retains those crazy discounted effects sometimes. And that means I think occasionally when you play this on turn 5, it's just going to win the game. There are some absurd, otherwise impossible battle cry synergies that can happen off Bandersmosh. and it's probably fine to sit in your hand for a few turns until things line up really nicely. You don't necessarily have to play it off a top deck or the turn you get it. Shaman has ways to generate lots of resources and have lots of decisions, so it's not like Bandersmosh is, in need of being played right away, so you can hold it for those high roll opportunities. To me, that means this card can do some crazy stuff that's otherwise impossible. It's just going to steal games sometimes, and it's going to be fairly frustrating to play against because you can't predict what it's going to do. You never really know what they're going to get, and sometimes you'll just lose to a random Bandersmosh. So to me, this card's actually kind of insane, and certainly not weak. I think this is really, really good, and it's going to be perhaps a problem in the meta. I may be the only person with that take, but I'm just seeing all kinds of crazy high rolls and some pretty consistent game otherwise. So keep an eye on this one. So next up here, we have the legendary dragon for Warlock, and we still don't have an official name on this one. Maybe it's like Netherspite or something, but it is an 8 mana 4/12, and it reads, whenever your hero takes damage, summon a 6/6 Nether Drake. Now this does not say damage on your turn like so many other cards we've seen before. I think cards like Floating Watcher, we've even got our new Diseased Vulture, these sorts of cards that are summoning things or doing things when you take damage on your turn. Synergizing with a handful of different self-damage cards. There's this kind of Pain Warlock archetype, as some people call it, that hasn't really gotten off the ground. The Vulture has certainly been a zoo package piece, but the rest of the archetypal cards haven't made it there. But maybe this dragon is finally enough to get that style of game plan over the hump and into competitive territory. I say maybe because I don't really think that it is. A lot of the comments that kind of applied to our previous dragon apply to this one. You play this, and I think it just kind of sits on board as a big pile of stats, and it's something that summons you more big piles of stats. I mean, certainly if you get 3 or 4 6/6s out of this, you're feeling pretty excited, like you got a ton of extra stats for your mana cost than what you'd expect based on some vanilla standpoints. But those stats don't have taunt, they don't have rush, they're just sort of sitting and chilling on board. They're very susceptible to any kind of straight removal because they didn't do anything, they didn't contribute before they got removed. So you play these down against a control warrior, and it's just like, oh, I got 1 6/6 by hero powering, and then the warrior just removed both my things, and we got nowhere, and I kind of wasted that card, or, at the very least, I traded 1 for 1 into a warrior removal spell, which is fine, but not especially exciting, right? It's not the kind of thing that wins you the game or gives you a distinct, huge advantage, which you typically expect for 8 mana or higher cards. You want them to really contribute to your game plan. So in what scenario does this look really good, right? Like maybe you plop this down against an aggro deck and you hope that, like, I'm going to survive this turn. They don't have quite enough to kill me, so as they attack me, I'm going to summon like 5 6/6s because I'm going to take 5 hits of damage, and maybe that's enough to counter pressure lethal, and that slows them down and it makes them trade. So it's kind of a, if you don't have lethal, this card has taunt sort of card, which is a more intriguing premise, I think, but compared to other like Pain Warlock cards, it's a little bit later in the curve. I don't know what kind of deck that is. This doesn't feel like the top end of a zoo deck, for instance. So is it more a mid-range deck? Is it a Highlander deck? How does that play in? Does it have synergies other than just being a big bomb itself? There are some questions there for me when it comes to context and deck fit. So do you power this yourself? Do you hope your opponent powers it? I don't really know. It's definitely the sort of card that creates friction. It creates interesting moments. I think it's fun from a design standpoint because it's not your turn only, but nonetheless, it still feels a little slow. It feels a little bit too expensive. Like if this was a 6 mana card that was, like a 4/8 instead, and it summoned 4/4s, I think that would just be so much more powerful because it's coming down at a stage of the game where it's making more of an impact, even though the stats are weaker. But at this higher mana total, I just have some doubts about this one. I kind of wanted to get there. That seems like a really fun card to me, and I would like that style of Warlock to see some play, but yet again, I just don't think it's strong enough. So next up here, let's take a look at the Bad Luck Albatross. This card's crazy. A new 3 mana 4/3 neutral beast with a death rattle. Shuffle 2 1/1 Albatross into your opponent's deck. So yeah, he's definitely some bad luck if your opponent kills him. So a bit like the Weasel Tunneler of old, a card that provides some deck disruption. Now, it doesn't provide infinitely looping deck disruption like the Weasel Tunneler, but nonetheless, putting 2 bad draws into your opponent's deck is a really big deal for a couple reasons. One, that's 2 things they can draw that are basically useless dead cards. Beyond that, the fact that there are 2 of them is going to be disruptive to Highlander decks. This is a really cheap tech to, at least for a few turns probably before they draw one of these Albatross, disrupt your opponent's Zephyrus or Bran or whatever it is that they're trying to pull off, which is really cool. Beyond that, the Bad Luck Albatross is actually just a good minion, a 4/3 for 3, great stat line, and it's a beast. So it has some synergies and things like Hunter, for instance, and it has Death Rattle synergies as well. So there's some Death Rattle decks that certainly wouldn't mind just dropping this on board and trying to utilize those Death Rattle synergies. So every way I break down this card, it actually looks really good. Like, it's just pretty surprisingly strong little card. So Zephyrus tech, good stats, Beast and Death Rattle synergies. That makes this one really nice. I think this card is absolutely going to find a home in a deck. Is it going to be in every deck? No, but any deck that can utilize one of these 3 different ways to slice this card is probably going to be fairly happy to play it. So you look at it as a first glance and you think it's just a meme card, but as I start to look deeper, I think this card has a real legitimate chance to be an impactful meta piece. Moving on here to the Dragoncaster for Mage. This is a 6 mana 4/4 with a battle cry that reads, you're holding a dragon, your next spell this turn costs 0. So in a lot of ways, this is kind of like a new Arcane Tyrant. Arcane Tyrant was the 4/4 that would go down to 0 mana after playing a high cost spell. This kind of works in the opposite direction than something like Arcane Tyrant or Anubis Defender now in Druid. Also a bit reminiscent of Ink Master Solia from back in the day, but this has a far less restrictive condition than Solia, which was a Highlander card. This is merely a Dragon Synergy card, which for Mage isn't really much of a problem. We've already seen a lot of the Dragon package in these more late game style Mages anyway, thanks to cards like Alexstrasza and Calicos. Mage is pretty happy to run some big dragons regardless. So filling out a Highlander or Control Mage deck with dragons is going to be a good fit, and that means Dragoncaster fits along rather nicely in that style of deck. So you can do a couple things, right? You can just play a spell of any cost really and get a discounted or even free or theoretically even negative mana cost 4/4, much like Arcane Tyrant of old, which by the way did get played some in Mage. So you cast a Flame Strike, you maybe even cast it a turn early, which is nice, and you get the 4/4, and that's a big swing turn, right? You can also just use this to cheat out a Luna's Pocket Galaxy or something even bigger like Yog's Puzzle Box or Power of Creation. So some potential discounts on your big heavy-hitting spells, even a Pyroblast, right? This would allow you to Pyroblast and Fireball in a single turn for like 16 damage. So there are all kinds of ways to use this thing for mana, but also that little swing on board, which is great. Does it seem like it's going to be worth that slot in your deck to just get a 4/4 or cheat spells out? I think so, yeah. I think it's really important sometimes to get that counter tempo when playing a really big spell so that you're finally ahead on board, start dictating the pressure a little bit, put your opponent on the back foot. That's usually a good thing to do, and that's why Arcane Tyrant and those sorts of cards do often see play. So yes, I think Dragoncaster lines up very well with Mage, makes a lot of sense for what it can do. Mana cheating, counter tempo, all great things. This looks like a very solid card. Speaking of very solid Mage cards, here we have Arcane Breath, a new 1-mana spell for Mage. This one's spooky. It deals 2 damage to a minion for 1 mana. That's already pretty good. And if you're holding a dragon, you also get to discover a spell. That is really, really good, because now not only do you have a great tempo play for 1 mana, but you're also generating some additional resources as well, which is exactly what indie kind of mage that's casting these cheap spells wants to do. This is a perfect fit for those, Sorcerer's Apprentice, Mana Cyclone style decks. We've also got Chinvala in there too now, which I'm still pretty doubtful of, but this is exactly the sort of card that something like Chinvala would absolutely adore, because it's free to play for your Sorcerer's Apprentice turn without sacrificing your hand size. You still retain resources. And discovering a spell means, it's not a random spell, so you're going to usually get something you want out of this as well. Maybe even more Arcane Breaths, for instance, which could chain to a terrifying degree. So, of course, this card looks amazing. It may not fit into, late game mage decks, but it kind of might, because discovering a spell means that you can run this without really risking losing a ton of resource advantage. And of course, it's going to fit any of those like Tempo Mage or Cyclone Mage packages as well. So, a lot of homes for a card like this one. It's very efficient for a, early game answering of flame imps and those sorts of things too. So all in all, this card feels very, very good across the board. Arcane Breath is pretty much exactly what Mage is looking for. Now, I guess I'll say that in a tempo deck, you may not always want to have a dragon. That is one limitation here. You typically would, run much more density of spells and fewer of dragons, but that restriction, frankly, is not even maybe relevant sometimes. Just dealing 2 damage for 1 mana might be enough in a Tempo Mage deck. And there's always ways to run like the new Malygos, for instance, maybe just 1 or 2 specific dragons that will occasionally give this the hit that it needs. Just camp one of those in your hand and make these Dragon Synergy cards worth it. So that's one, small challenge to this card's success, but frankly, I think it overcomes that pretty easily, and this remains a very powerful card. Moving on here, we have Cumulus Maximus. He is a 5 mana, 5/5 elemental for Shaman. And his battlecry reads, if you have overloaded mana crystals, deal 5 damage. So if you're overloaded, this guy has a very big and swingy battlecry. It's basically like that Firelands Portal style swing, where you get a nice minion and you deal 5 damage, but it's only 5 mana, guys, which is very cheap for a card like this. It's kind of crazy. Also kind of Blaze Caller-esque in a way, I guess, right? But again, even cheaper and conditionally, I think perhaps even easier than things like Blaze Caller in the past, just because Shaman likes to overload, particularly these days with, Sludge Slurpers. It's not hard for Shaman to hit an overloaded mana crystal, and Cumulus Maximus lines up in Battlecry decks fairly well as well. You just hit that button and suddenly this is, a 7 mana Pyroblast essentially that can do a ton of extra face damage. Now, it is competing against, again, cheaper Battlecries like we talked about with Nathaok. This is starting to get a little bit expensive for Battlecries, right? You've got like Weaponized Wasp that does a similar thing, dealing, board damage, but it's much cheaper to flex into a turn alongside lackeys. You've even got like your Kobold Lackey that does the same thing. So is this better than those? I mean, it's better in like normal Hearthstone, but I don't know if it's better in Battlecry Quest Shaman Hearthstone. I sort of think those cheaper ones go a little bit longer and offer the same sorts of opportunities. That said, a card like this is just so good at what it does that, Battlecry Shaman might change over time. This could go in just an overload deck as well, which we've seen certainly some success with in Shaman recently, kind of topping out your curve in those sorts of decks with a card like this. So yeah, I mean, this card is just good. It just does great things. So although it may not fit exactly as we see Shaman today, I think it's good enough that it's going to fit somewhere. This is a very powerful effect, very swingy for turn 5, and a super strong card. Nathaok is a 3-star card. Yeah, I think Bandersmosh is maybe a 5-star card. Unnamed Warlock Legendary is a 3-star card. Bad Luck Albatross is a 4-star card. Dragoncaster is a 4-star card. Arcane Breath is a 4-star card. Cumulus Maximus is a 4-star card. And there you go, folks. That wraps it up for these cards. I gotta be honest, this expansion is like breaking my bell curve. I normally am able to retain a pretty nice like bell curve for card ratings where there's a lot of 2- and 3-star cards, a little bit less on the 4 mark, and then very few 5-star cards and, a handful of 1-star cards, because I think that's typically how Hearthstone lines up. It just kind of happens that way most of the time. But man, this expansion, everything is so good. I'm pumping out a lot of 4-star reviews. I think the power level is going to reflect that. So, I mean, hopefully it remains accurate, but it has certainly changed how a normal curve looks for ratings in Hearthstone. So stay tuned. That said, do you guys think these are going to be 4-star cards? If everything is good, are they all actually good at all? Or are they just something's going to rise to the top? I guess we'll see. Share your thoughts as always below. But until then, thanks much for watching. And until next time, game on.